speciation. This is how new species are formed. So there's two basic things that we're going to go over. The first one is allopatric speciation. Populations are separated by a geographical barrier. So in this case, it's a river. Could be islands that certain birds were blown out to, or could be mountains between the species or between the populations. But at any rate, it's going to slow gene flow, which means the folks over here are not going to be able to mate with the folks over here. And so you can imagine one population separated by some geographical barrier. Either the river formed, around the population, through the population, or maybe some of them were able to move over here one time, during some crazy event or something. And so random mutations are going to build up separately on different sides in the different populations. And the selective pressures might be different on the two sides. So for example, this side might be a bit windier. Maybe the soil gets eroded a little bit more. Maybe there's a predator that comes over from the mountains on this side that never makes it over to that side. So you can imagine that the selective pressures might be a little bit different on each side. So organisms living on one side of the barrier cannot mate with organisms on the other side of the barrier. So there's no what we call gene flow. Random mutations and different selective pressures may eventually lead to a new species. Here's another one. This is a lot harder to understand. It's called sympatric speciation. That's when you have new species form in the same area, which is kind of crazy with no geographical barrier. So here's one example. Reproductively isolated subpopulations in the midst of a parent population would happen, and so that would be a change in a niche. So there are two different types of flies here. Well, actually, I lied. There are one population of flies, but some of them live on the native hawthorn. They actually tend to spend more time here. So some of the flies like to eat hawthorn fruit. This is like an apple, but its skin is thinner, so the flies with the thinner mandibles or mouthpieces do fine. They tend to mate with other flies that are hanging out right here on the hawthorn. And then there are flies of the same population that started to eat the imported apple. So some of the flies like to eat the apples. The skin is thicker, so the flies with the larger, sharper mandibles do better there. And they tend to mate with others that are eating the same apples. And so maybe they might even flower at slightly different times and produce their fruit even maybe slightly different times. So they might mate at different times. Or they might flower at the same time, and these just happen to mate with the ones that are around the hawthorns, and these happen to mate with the ones that are around the apples. And so you can imagine if that continues for many, 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 many generations, that there might be different mutations that are randomly produced in each population, and over a long period of time, you might end up with different species. So gene flow has been reduced between the flies that feed on the different food varieties, even though they both live in the same geographical area. It's kind of crazy. Here's another example. This one is a really kind of cool example. This is called a ring species. This provides examples of what seems to be various stages in the gradual divergence of new species from common ancestors. So here's a salamander, and it lives in Oregon. And this salamander, over a long period of time, has, some of them have stayed here, but some of them have migrated south. So some of them have migrated along the coast of California, and some have migrated inland in California. And so there's a mountain here that separates them. So some populations are capable of interbreeding, but others are not. So one example of a ring species is this salamander, Ensatina escolitzi, maybe. Notice that it's italicized and that you capitalize the genus but not the species. Anyway, this expanded south from Oregon down through California. At the northern end of the ring, the coastal and the inland populations interbreed and produce viable offspring. So if you take these folks and you put them together, they can make a baby. That's the definition of a species. But, so in this area, they're a single biological species. But here's the crazy part. At the southern end of the ring, the coastal and the inland populations do not interbreed, even when they overlap. So if you take some of these and you put them together, they don't make a baby. That means if every other one died here, these are two different species. We can't really call them two different species because that one can mate with that one, which 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 can mate with that one. So somebody in the ring can mate, but at the very end they can't, which is, I don't know, kind of cool. So in this area down here, they appear to be two different species. So species is a nice term for us when things fit. So a species is defined as a group of organisms that can mate with each other potentially and produce fertile offspring. Here, this is, they're not really fitting into our nice definition of species, but that's life. Okay, isolating mechanisms. These are things that tend to separate organisms so they can become different species. So even when a population is very diverse, organisms are all the same species as long as they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So there's a certain amount of diversity within horses, let's say, but they're all the same species because they can all reproduce and make fertile offspring together. Isolating mechanisms prevent gene flow. So they prevent genes from one population to another from occurring. So isolating mechanisms prevent gene flow between two populations so that differences can build up between the two and a new species can develop. So here are the types of isolating mechanisms, two basic types, prezygotic and postzygotic. Prezygotic means this is something that happens so that they can't even make a zygote. So organisms do not make a zygote, so no offspring is made at all. So one prezygotic isolation mechanism is a temporal isolation. That means the potential mates live in the same area, but they reproduce at different times. So an example of that is this frog that breeds in March to May, and then this frog, and that breeds in January through March. And so even though they live in the same place, they tend to breed at different times, and so over a long period of time, they became two different species. You can see they're the same genus, but they're different species. Another example is behavioral isolation. So this is a prezygotic mechanism because if you have this bird and it does its dance for the female, if it does a dance slightly different, the female will say, nope, I'm going to wait for a better male. So potential mates meet, but they don't behave the right way. So in this example, the male bird doesn't have the right dance. And so the female says, nope, I'm going to hold off. Mechanical isolation is when potential mates attempt to mate, so they do the right behaviors, they behave at the right time, or they mate at the right time, but the sperm can't successfully be transferred. So that means the parts don't fit. So if you are far enough apart in populations, then that will happen. Another is gametic mortality. So the sperm is transferred, but the egg is not fertilized. So that might happen if maybe the sperm doesn't have the right proteins on its surface, and so they don't fit the receptors on the egg, and so the sperm, although it's in the right place and is gotten there, the sperm cannot actually get into the egg. And then another is ecological isolation. The potential mates occupy different local habitats within the same area. So they live in the same area, maybe mate at the same time. But so we saw this one before. So this is a frog that breeds in fast-moving streams, whereas this is actually another species now, breeds in permanent ponds. So just like a slow water. So the metamorphosis time of the tadpoles are therefore correspondingly different. Now the opposite, so those were all prezygotic. Now we're going to talk about postzygotic. That means the mates mate and they make a zygote, but then something happens afterwards. So that means the hybrids, the offspring that are made, have a problem. So they could have zygote mortality, which means the zygote's made, but it dies during early embryonic development. They could have hybrid inviability. That means the hybrid's made, but it's not strong and it doesn't tend to live long enough to reproduce. Or they could have hybrid sterility. That means the hybrid, the baby, is made and it's robust, it's strong, it does a great job, but it's sterile or has low fertility, and so that would prevent the genes from being transferred from one population to another. So we'll look at that last one. So for example, if a female horse is bred with a male donkey, then they're going to make a mule. So that says that these two are different species, but they were once the same species, and it's been not so long since they were the same species because they can still make a viable offspring. This is a mule. It's really, really strong. It's a great farm animal, but it doesn't, it can't reproduce on its own. It can't reproduce itself. These two can make it, but they won't have any grandchildren from that one. Another example is a liger. It's a crossbreed between a male lion and a female tiger. They're the world's largest cats, and I think their fertility is reduced. Zebroid is any cross between a zebra and any other type of horse. A camel, I just put this in because it was cute. This is a hybrid between a camel and a llama, and they're born by artificial insemination because these two can't actually mate in nature. I just put it in because it was super cute. And that is the end of this one.